Takk, Magne. Og takk til Initiativ for etisk handel for invitasjon til å snakke med dere. Og gratulerer med heftet. Det er en viktig del av Norges innsats og ledelse på den feltet med CSR og menneskerettighet. Som Magne sagt, jeg skal ikke plage dere videre med dårlig norsk mitt. Særlig på dette temaet, hvor jeg er vant til å snakke på engelsk mye internasjonalt. The theme that I've been asked to speak about is what are due diligence? What is due diligence? And it's really very simple. But before I continue, I would warn you, always beware of researchers saying it's really very simple. But first, human rights due diligence is what business does to ensure that it's not infringing on the rights of others. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights states that a business is responsible for respecting human rights, for ensuring that it doesn't have negative impacts on the rights of others. That's how it defines respect for human rights. That responsibility to respect human rights is based on a definition of business responsibility, which makes every business responsible for its impacts through its activities and relationships. So due diligence is the method or process through which business ensures that it is examining its activities and relationships to ensure it's respecting human rights, not infringing on the rights of others. In theory, human rights due diligence involves a business in the process of understanding what it's doing in a social context. In practice, what this means is looking for risks of harms or abuses connected to what a business does, and then doing something about it. Okay. Seems somewhat simple. What does it mean, or first of all, where does it come from? Since the unanimous endorsement by the Human Rights Council in Geneva in June 2011 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, human rights due diligence has been integrated or incorporated into a whole range of multilateral tools and instruments that are relevant for Norwegian companies. And you've heard some of them mentioned here today. The OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises was revised in 2011. It was revised formally and accepted by the Council at the OECD the month before the Guiding Principles. But its revision was conducted in full cooperation and consultation between the team in the OECD and the team behind the Guiding Principles. The EU CSR strategy was revised in 2012, and in 2012 and 2013, we're seeing the Commission run a series of processes around guidance for due diligence in 3 sectors: information and communications technology, oil and gas, and employment agencies. In 2012, the OECD Common Approaches for Export Credit Agencies revised the common approaches and included reference to the Guiding Principles for Human Rights. The performance standards of the International Finance Corporation were similarly revised. They've also been integrated, the Guiding Principles have also been integrated to a variety of multi-stakeholder and market-based tools or approaches to ethical business. It includes the ISO 26000 guidance on social responsibility, which has a chapter on human rights. The OECD's guidance on responsible supply chain management for conflict minerals. And of course, the work of organizations like Initiativ for etisk handel. And in this specific booklet. So the concept of human rights in all of these initiatives can be traced back to the UN Guiding Principles and the work of Professor John Ruggie in finding an appropriate and workable answer to a very basic question. What does it mean in practice for a business to respect human rights? Ruggie's answer, the answer of the guiding principles, is that internationally proclaimed human rights, the International Bill of Human Rights, the ILO core conventions, are the standards against which to assess business behavior. Due diligence is the way for business to show that it's respecting those rights, in other words, meeting those standards. Okay, you're going to hear a lot further on this morning about due diligence in practice, but I'm just going to give a very short summary, conceptual summary. So, due diligence in practice. The implication of the definition I've just described, that is, every business is responsible for its impacts, both through its activities and its relationships to others. The implication of that is that the nature of responsibility in practice will change according to the nature of the business activity. So in practice, due diligence will be different from industry to industry and, in fact, from company to company. But once a company makes a commitment, it is possible to speak generally about what due diligence looks like. And there's three basic functions once a company makes a commitment to respecting human rights. That's what we've heard already from the minister and what we'll hear more about today. It's identifying actual or potential rights impacts, what this guide calls assessing. It's preventing and mitigating those impacts, what in the guide is called adapting and collaborating. And it's accounting for impacts and the responses to them, what in this guide is called measuring, reporting, and communicating. These are the basic steps in a process that should be part of a management process, integrated to company decision-making. When it comes to supply chains, as this guide shows, it's a process that is not a one-off, but it's an ongoing process of assessment, adaptation, communication, and reassessment. In principle, the due diligence assessments examine the interrelationship between business activity and a human rights context in a particular time and place. Due diligence generates what the guiding principles refers to as human rights risks. And we heard the minister just now use that word. The sources of those risks lie in the human rights context and the way business activity interacts with that context. So labor rights may be poorly enforced in a particular country, but your business's relationship to the risk of sweatshop labor, for example, or poor working conditions, depends on the nature of your business activities and relationships. So in practice, due diligence will mean mapping out your supply chain and using that as the lens through which to identify how your activities intersect with human rights abuse. Once that's been done, the challenge is to do something about the risks or the violations that you've identified. And we will hear more about the practicalities of doing this throughout the morning. I'd like to make a couple of points on the practice of supply chain due diligence in particular, based on my experience of the past 3 years in developing the OECD's responsible supply chains, guidance on responsible supply chains in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Basically, conflict minerals, and in particular, 4 minerals coming from eastern DR Congo: tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. That process has been a multi-stakeholder process involving representatives from governments, civil society, labor, and business, including some of the largest high-tech aerospace industry companies in the world, as well as representatives of artisanal miners from the Kivus in DRC, and everybody in between. And that's probably the first point. Engagement by all sides is the key to making a start, a key to defining the standards, and a key to developing practice. But it's important to keep in mind that while due diligence in supply chains emphasizes engagement, it's basically what supply chain due diligence is about. There will be times when engagement cannot be sustained. The point of engagement is to change behavior for the better, to allow trade to continue and to contribute to social and economic development. This is true even in the worst human rights situations, such as conflicts like the DRC, or such as situations where your supply chain is in countries where there's widespread forms of child labor, for example. But where a company's own due diligence measured over time, shows that engagement is not working, that behavior is not changing for the better, then disengagement or excluding your suppliers from your chain should always be an option. Without that option on the table, engagement simply doesn't work. There will be little incentive for suppliers to change behavior. Second point I want to make, also about effectiveness, is that the design of supply chain due diligence systems must take into consideration the entire value chain. Without taking into consideration all participants in the chain, from producers of raw materials to those who produce the final product for end use, problems like forced labor and child labor will persist. They are structural problems in those economies and in those societies. At the company level, this means that while one company's contracts with suppliers may only create legal obligations 1 or 2 steps down the supply chain, effectiveness of the overall approach demands that ethical oversight cover the entire chain. This is also a core concept of ethical trade, I'm told by my colleagues from the initiative. As a former CEO of a large multinational once remarked, your lawyers may tell you that legally it's not your liability, but your customers will tell you that it's definitely your responsibility. Third, it's very difficult for ethical behavior of one company to change the structural reality for workers or households at the upstream, at the point of production, where it really matters. And so to reduce and manage the risks that global supply chains benefit from human rights abuses usually requires industry-wide approaches. Industry-level approaches to due diligence practice helps to clarify expectations for business and reduce the likelihood that business pioneers in this field and good performers will be penalized with loss of market share. An industry-level approach is also a way for ethical companies to help scale up or expand the impact of the ethical values of production in the social and economic conditions for people living in those economies. Okay, finally, by way of conclusion, I just want to say a couple of things about human rights due diligence and the role of governments. The guiding principles, as we heard just now from the minister, make clear that the responsibility to respect human rights is embedded within the state duty to protect human rights. In other words, business has a responsibility to respect human rights, but states have a duty to ensure that they do so. An expert group I participated in last year, which was commissioned by a group of global civil society organizations, looked at the legal systems of countries in every region of the world. We didn't look at every country, but we took selected countries from every region. And we found that due diligence is commonly used by the legal systems of states in every region of the world, across legal traditions. And I'm speaking from the US to China, from Australia to Nigeria, from Argentina to the EU and its member states. We found 100 examples of due diligence in 20 different countries, in both civil and common law jurisdictions. We also found that those forms of due diligence, the procedural forms of due diligence in those examples, are consistent with the procedures described in the guiding principles and as described in this booklet. We concluded that on the basis of that coherence, it's possible to describe an emerging standard of due diligence procedure that is familiar in many jurisdictions. And because of the integration to those various international multilateral tools that I described earlier, it's becoming global. So the good news is that we found extensive evidence of state practice with respect to regulating due diligence. The bad news is that we found little in the form of explicit mention or reference of human rights in those due diligence mechanisms. There are, as the minister indicated, a range of ways in which states protect human rights from business-related harms. Everything from Arbeitsmilieuloven to consumer protection, to environmental protection, even land tenancy laws. All of these serve to protect human rights. The minister is correct, in my view, that the Norwegian model is in fact protecting human rights. It is a form of CSR. It's not called that I don't believe it should be called that necessarily, but in practice, that's what it's doing. It's raising living standards, but it's going beyond raising living standards. It's protecting workers' rights. It's protecting the rights of people in society in their relationship with business. Many of the examples we looked at did deploy due diligence in order to do so, but explicit reference to human rights was missing. So we concluded in this study that the obstacle to regulating human rights due diligence by business must be considered rather low. And second, that states could make far greater use of legal tools to ensure respect for human rights in general, and to ensure that companies implement due diligence for human rights in particular. So in short, one of the implications of the emergence of the due diligence standards that we're going to talk about today, one of the implications for government, is that the time is approaching when the protection of human rights should be given the same degree of attention which the law has given to other areas in which business causes harms or contributes to undermining public goods. So how states do so will be a function of the particular legal tradition, the nature of the business activity to be regulated, and the particular human rights questions involved. Due diligence practice looks familiar wherever you go, and it will continue to do so when applied to human rights. But the policy mix, the regulations and policies that are implemented by governments that implement due diligence in national laws will be different. In all cases, the role of the due diligence rules remains the same, and it's two basic objectives: to simultaneously, one, clarify for business what it means to respect human rights, and two, make it easier for consumers, workers, regulators, courts, and society in general to assess business compliance with those standards, with those human rights standards. Tack för uppmärksamhet.